Hello, Grace Church. This is Gary. I'm here for the February, say the 5th reading of our chronological Through the Bible in 1 Year. And today we are covering Exodus chapters 13, 14, and 15. Quick overview. Chapter 13 begins with, consecrate unto me the firstborn. And what we have here is something very interesting. It is actually a liturgical section. So chapter 13 is an interim chapter. It comes after the 12 plagues, and it's right before the Red Sea crossing. What is interesting about it is the book of Exodus is kind of structured or compiled after the fact, and we're going to see many layers of this construction taking place here. The big one here is chapter 13. What you'll notice is that in addition to consecrating the firstborn, it has the command to wear the tefillin. That's the command of the Lord, to have the word of the Lord between your eyes and on your forearm. There's also the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which symbolizes the notion of running out in haste, fleeing Egypt in haste. And all of this, you'll see again and again, this refrain is because the Lord has redeemed you with his outstretched arm, with his mighty hand. And so we have the establishment of Israel's liturgy, and that's the key thing that's taking place, is that we have what scholars would call a leitmotif, or what we might call an archetype, is that the Exodus story is an archetype of salvation history, and every step of the way we're to recall the salvation of the Lord with his outstretched arm. When we get to chapter 14, we actually have the crossing of the Red Sea. The key thing that takes place with the crossing of the Red Sea is not just the redemption of Israel, not just the Egyptians being turned back, but the finality of Israel's redemption. As we see in the New Testament, Paul talks about this crossing of the Red Sea as being a symbol of baptism. But one of the things I really like the most about it, and it's really quite morbid, is that the Egyptian bodies are washed upon the shore, and Exodus makes it a point to note this, that they look at the Egyptians, they see them, and there's this critique of empire. It's something that begins all the way in Exodus and continues throughout the entire Old Testament narrative. And in that moment, when Israel looks upon the bodies of the dead Egyptians, there's this recollection that they are not like us. And so when we get to chapter 15, we get the Song of Moses. This section is considered to be, from a literary perspective, probably one of the oldest sections of the Exodus. If there was anything that was written in the context of the Exodus, it's the songs of Moses and the songs of Miriam. And so here we are having like the kernel of the visceral response of Israel immediately after the Exodus event, immediately after the Red Sea crossing. And it's the song of jubilation. It's the song of triumph. The chapter interestingly ends with the Israelites complaining that there is no water. And this is kind of significant because they just saw an abundance of water that washed away all of Egypt. And so it kind of ends with Israel's grumbling. And this again leads us to a motif that we're going to see throughout the story of Israel, all throughout the Pentateuch, and then through all the rest of the Old Testament. And it's something that we need to bend our ear to. And it's this constant grumbling that takes place even in the midst of God's salvation. In these 3 chapters, the one part that stood out the most for me, and kind of stumbling over maybe a little bit, is the end of chapter 13, where almost like a footnote, it says, they carried with them the bones of Joseph. As you know, we just went through the Genesis story, and Joseph was there. He's the one who redeemed Israel in the Genesis narrative. And so the bones of Joseph are being carried out as he prophesied they would be, and they're being taken to be buried in the promised land. And for a nation who is in exile, when we look at the Old Testament narrative, this promise of the bones of Joseph, that they're going to go be taken out and taken to the promised land, is a reminder that in the midst of all of our trials, that exile is only temporary and that God's promises endure forever.